Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have covered Broadway for 30 years now. And I do believe that Broadway does not get the credit it deserves for saving this city in its hour of need. And I'm going to take you back to the 1970s, when the city was bankrupt, and Times Square was not the Times Square of The Lion King and Aladdin and SpongeBob SquarePants, but a dangerous and a scary place. Everybody was leaving the city back then. But there was one industry that couldn't leave the city, and that was Broadway. And there were two people who came together and formed a unique friendship that changed everything. Bernard Jacobs took over the Shubert organization, which owns many of the Broadway theaters, in 1972, and that company was insolvent, on the verge of bankruptcy. And Bernie Jacobs was a lawyer. He'd worked for the Shuberts for many years as a lawyer, but he wasn't a producer. He really wasn't even a creative kind of guy. But he took over this company that had these theaters that were empty. Theaters like the Broadhurst were empty for years. These theaters were not landmarked. They had more value as parking lots. And Bernie Jacobs thought, I have to get something to put in these theaters. I have to find shows. But how do you find shows? Bernie Jacobs is not a director, he's not a writer. But what he understands is he has to find someone, a creative person, who's going to imagine a show that might work. And as Bernie Jacobs was looking for that person, he went to the opening night of a musical called Coco. And the young choreographer of Coco was a man named Michael Bennett. And at the opening night party, Bernie was curious, and he went over to Michael Bennett. And Bernie was a man maybe in his 60s, and Michael was 25. And Bernie Jacobs said, I'm curious, how do you handle Katharine Hepburn, the star of Coco? And Michael Bennett said, it's easy. If I want her to go right, I tell her to go left. And Bernie Jacobs thought, that is a clever young man. I'm going to stay in touch with him. And a few years later, Michael had this idea, a kind of strange idea for a show, about the kids who dance in the chorus. Not a show about a star. In fact, there is going to be no star in his show. It's going to be about his friends who've been Broadway dancers, who've been gypsies. And Michael got them all together one night at an old tape recorder and heard their stories and recorded their stories. They drank a lot of cheap wine, smoked a lot of pot. I've heard the tapes, and you can tell. But the very first thing Michael says in this recording session is, I don't know what this is going to be. It could be a TV show, it could be a movie, it could be a Broadway show. All I know is that I'm going to call it a chorus line. So Michael Bennett and Ed Kleben and Marvin Hamlisch went to Joe Papp, running the Public Theater. Joe listened to the tapes for about 15 minutes and said, here's some money, go to work. And they begin to develop a chorus line. Now, Joe Papp had a habit of running out of money. And about 8 months into the development of a chorus line, he was out of money. And the show wasn't finished. And he said to Michael, that's it, it's over, too bad, I have no money. And Michael thought, I'm friendly with Bernie Jacobs up at the Shubert offices. And he said to Marvin Hamlisch, and Marvin told me this story, he said, we're going to take our show up to the Shuberts, and we're going to audition it for Bernie Jacobs. Now, Bernie's a middle-aged guy. Don't do any of those sad songs. We're going to do that tits and ass number. So up they go in the cab. The Shubert offices today are plush with Flemish tapestries and antiques because the Shuberts are very rich. But in 1974, they were not so rich. And Marvin Hamlisch went up to the Shubert offices, and he sat at the grand piano there that, as he told me, looked like it hadn't been played since Sigmund Romberg was the in-house composer for the Shubert brothers. And he lifted the cover of the piano, and blew the dust off the keys, and hit the first note of Dance 10 Looks 3, and the leg of the piano collapsed. And Marvin thought, this is how you audition a Broadway show? And Bernie Jacobs and Michael Bennett lifted that piano up, and they held that piano while Marvin Hamlisch played the score to a chorus line. And then Michael said to Bernie Jacobs, Joe Papp has run out of money. You can have my show. Bernie Jacobs was a very wise man, and he said, you know, I can't do that. I can't do that to Joe. And Michael said, well, if you don't take it, it's not going to go anywhere. He said, no, you don't understand. I can't steal a show or take a show from Joe Papp because he's trying to do other things that I might one day need in my theater. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lend him the money so that you can finish the show down there, and we'll see what happens. And of course, what happened was a chorus line was the Hamilton of its day. And it moved from the Public Theater to the Shubert Theater. Bernie Jacobs thought it would run 5 years. It ran 15 years. The Shuberts were practically bankrupt, and all of a sudden they have this show, a chorus line, in this neighborhood that people are afraid to go to. And all of a sudden, things begin to change. A chorus line, a Broadway show, is on the cover of Time and Newsweek. An industry that we all love, that was in dire, dire straits, suddenly now has a show that everybody in the world knows about. And attendance, which had completely fallen off in 72 and 73. 72, 4 million people saw a Broadway show. By 75 and 76, when a chorus line was there, it went up to 6 million people. And the money that came in from a chorus line allowed the Shuberts to refurbish the theaters, to invest in other creators, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Cameron McIntosh, Stephen Sondheim, who would create many of the shows that would help lift Broadway in the 1980s. And all around the industry of Broadway, you have restaurants that are selling more alcohol and food. Parking garages that were empty are now full. Other businesses start to come around Broadway because Broadway is thriving. And a chorus line runs 15 years and travels all over the world and makes hundreds of millions of dollars, saves the Shuberts, who can preserve those theaters that we love, and allow them to invest in other shows. So when you talk about what saved New York City in the 70s, you will hear people say Wall Street was important, real estate was important, law enforcement was important, all true. But you rarely hear people say the theater, the arts, were important to saving Broadway, Times Square, and this city. And it gives me a great thrill whenever I walk around my neighborhood, Times Square and Broadway, to see all of those theaters full, to see lots of people going and excited to go to the theater, and to know, but for this relationship between these two people, Bernie Jacobs and Michael Bennett, that whole landscape, that whole business might not have existed. So that, I believe, is the importance of the theater and the arts. Thank you.